Today we're going to rank every single one of the UK's poet laureates. But firstly, what is a poet laureate? You probably are familiar with the term. At time of recording, the current poet laureate is Simon Armitage. The previous poet laureate was Ann Duffy. Ted Hughes was a poet laureate. William Wordsworth was a poet laureate. And though Ben Jonson was appointed somewhat of a title back in, I believe, 1616, the official first poet laureate was John Dryden. The monarch appoints the poet laureate, and this is backed up by some advice from the Prime Minister. And usually you get a few £1,000s and tons of sherry. Ted Hughes got 700 odd bottles of sherry. I think Ann Duffy got a few crates of sherry and a couple of grand too. What does a poet laureate do? Well, there's nothing contractual, but they are kind of expected to reflect the national public mood. So essentially, they write public anthems. If there is a monarch getting crowned, if there is a day of big national importance, they'll usually pen something upon the subject matter. They also typically do a lot of philanthropic work in regards to popularising poetry. Ann Duffy, for example, is responsible for a lot of poetry anthologies and getting a lot of poetry in schools. So let's rank them and compare them in a big long list. Poets like Philip Larkin, Thomas Gray and Walter Scott famously turned down the poet laureateship, and many might wonder, why would one turn down the poet laureateship? Like, why would one turn down a Nobel Prize? Well, the poet laureateship isn't indicative always of quality. People might be mistaken for thinking, well, if you're the poet laureate, you are the best poet writing in the country at that time. But the reason poets, and I think Philip Larkin's a great poet, I think Thomas Gray is a great poet, the reason they turn the laureateship down is because there are some issues that come hand in hand with accepting that title. First and foremost, it is somewhat of a balancing act to be the voice of a nation and still keep and uphold your own poetic integrity. Many people will consider it selling out if one were to accept the laureateship. A lot of the poets who did accept it, there was a lot of conflict. They were worried this might actually tarnish my image. People might not trust my poetry. I might just be a mouthpiece or somewhat of a sycophantic flatterer to the court, for example, and I might not actually stay true to what I actually believe. And this is true too, and this is partly one of the reasons why many of the poet laureates have gone into oblivion and are forgotten today. And that drums up an interesting issue when it comes to trying to rank the poet laureates. Do we rank them based on their historical importance? Because some of the poets, they're not aesthetically the best, but they might have some historical importance because perhaps, like one of them, they edited the works of Shakespeare, or perhaps they were historically important by virtue of being one of the first of a certain kind to get the laureateship. So there's that toss-up when we rank them. Should we rank them based on their historical merit or their aesthetic merit? Do we rank them on how well they've managed to capture the public mood? Indeed, if we're reading a poet even 100, maybe even 50 years after their demise, do we even know what the public mood would have been? Can we even understand it? Or do we just rank them based on our own enjoyment? I'm trying to combine all of them in my personal ranking of these poets. Another issue, and this is something you'll see when you go through the list of poet laureates from the United Kingdom, is this idea of being timely versus posthumous. Actually, poets, real poets, sincere poets, kind of will probably err on the side of wanting to be posthumous. That means that they will pass on their poetic merit through the ages. A lot of poets, we don't unlock the power of a lot of poets. I'm thinking of poets like Emily Dickinson until long after their passing. They're not timely, and the problem with some of these poet laureates is they're very much timely. They're very much period poets, period pieces. That is what they are writing first and foremost, which, of course, if you're trying to appeal to a nation and give voice to a nation at a very specific time in history, how can you not fail but become a period piece? Then there's also the issue of what they've done for poetry as an art versus their own poetry. A lot of the poet laureates, they're great and they're applaudable and respectable by virtue of the fact that they've simply got the conversation going. They've popularised poetry, or they've done something in the educational system. But when you examine their poetry, it may not be the best poetry that one could think of, so you've got that little balancing act as well. Of course, here's a disclaimer. Historical foresight is a bit of a mug's game. So who can say which one of the poets, at least the ones closer to our time today, who can say which ones will endure or not? I'm taking a bit of a gamble, but I think my top spot rankings are fairly immutable, and I think in such a subjective art as poetry, yes, personal enjoyment comes into it, temperament, proclivity, I think these are objectively the best poets. Once you get past the first, I don't know, maybe 3, 4, 5, then it becomes wildly speculative. Okay, let's get into the ranking. Now, I toyed with doing a reverse ranking, but I don't like those videos. I just want to see who's number one and then work backwards from there. So we're starting with one of my personal favourite poets of all time. It is Alfred Lord Tennyson. Ulysses, great poem. Mariana, great poem. Tithonus, In Memoriam, Charge of the Light Brigade, which would have been his national anthem. It would have been his period piece. And that one does ring, even though it's poetically quite perfect, that one does ring a little bit like a period piece. But Tithonus, Ulysses, many of his other poems, they are endlessly rereadable. The phrasing is inevitable, it's deeply pleasurable, and there's a strong sense of sincere melancholy running through all of Tennyson's works. He was the poet who seemed to know the weight and balance and colour and shape of every single word in the English language, apart from, I believe, scissors. A great poet. I would highly recommend you pick up a copy of his poetry and enjoy. He needs to be read aloud and he needs to be memorised. So that's my number one. That's the greatest poet laureate in the United Kingdom of all time, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Number two is William Wordsworth, the father of the Romantic period. Tintern Abbey, The Prelude, there's plenty more. But if you love sort of pastoral poetry, if you love Keats and you love Shelley and you like Blake, you like Coleridge and Byron, you have to read Wordsworth. He's the father of them all, essentially. He's a big figurehead for the movement. Along with Shakespeare and Milton, Wordsworth is our national poet. Now, his standard, his quality dropped as he got a bit older, and if you read biographies of him, there are issues here and there. People may not like William Wordsworth, I may not like William Wordsworth, but Tintern Abbey does something very special to me, so I would implore you to read it. So that's number two, William Wordsworth. Number three, the first official poet laureate, and that's John Dryden. He did a very interesting, or at least historically interesting, translation of Virgil's Aeneid. It's probably relatively unreadable. There are better translations. It's very much a Restoration era, again, period piece. Dryden was responsible for translating many of the works of Shakespeare to the stage. He had a load of thoughts to do with translation, so when you start getting into translation, figuring out the art and the philosophy behind translation, John Dryden has a few cool things to say. He wrote for the stage. Marriage a la mode is worth digging into, I don't know if you could see a performance of it, but he's good. If you can get into Restoration era, which is it can be a bit dry as far as us reading it today goes, but he's one of the best, so Dryden, he has to be number three. Number four, a controversial one, is Ted Hughes. He wrote Crow, poems like Bayonet Charge, The Thought Fox from Hawk in the Rain. The Thought Fox is a lovely poem. I would implore you to go read it right now. Ted Hughes got a lot of furore and anger. I believe he's responsible, or people want to make him responsible, for two ladies' suicides. One very famous lady, Sylvia Plath, who was married to him. I don't know really anything about his personal history. I've had a lot of people say that from what they know, he wasn't a very pleasant man. Hey, I'll take your word for it. His poetry is pretty good, but if you want to dig into the biography of some of these poets and contest their artistic merit on the basis of their biography, then we've got a lot to get through, because actually most writers are not saints, apart from Shakespeare and Jane Austen and maybe Chekhov, actually definitely Chekhov. Every other writer in history has been deeply troubled. So let's not attack them based on that. This isn't a ranking on who was the best person, it's the ranking of perhaps who was the most important or the most aesthetically pleasing poet laureate. Is Ted Hughes there? Am I confident about him? Not really. I'm confident that Tennyson's number one and Wordsworth's number two, though there might be interchangeability, maybe Wordsworth's number one. And I'm relatively confident that Dryden comes in third spot. Ted Hughes, I think after fourth place, everything is somewhat up for grabs until you get to the really unknown poets. Number five, I think I'm going to put Simon Armitage. Now, I think, unfortunately, I really like him. I think he might be more of a period piece, but I'm not sure, because he's the current poet laureate. So to put the current poet laureate so high up is really difficult, because I don't have historical hindsight. Maybe in 200 years we'll know if that was the right decision or not. I'm not fully convinced. All I know is I used to read volumes of his poetry, like Kid and Book of Matches, and he did some great translations like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I used to read them like cover to cover, almost like listening to an album in its entirety. He's written some poetry recently that's very timely about lockdowns and about the passing of Prince Philip. I think the poem's called The Patriarchs. I like his wrangling with language. I like the sounds he makes. I'm not too bothered about his politically charged stuff, and I can't say that I read him too much now, but I put him there with a sense of nostalgia because I did read him and like him. Number 6, John Betjeman. John Betjeman is a slice of old England. He was writing around the war era. He was big into a lot of things, not just poetry, architecture, restoring Victorian architecture, restoring railways. He did a lot of hands-on stuff for society, and he was big into broadcasting. Perhaps he's a little bit twee. His verse is often very humorous. You might know his "Come friendly bombs and fall on slough. It isn't fit for humans now. There isn't grass to graze a cow." A bit unfair on Slough, but anyone who's been there might find themselves chanting this poem. So John Betjeman is at number 6. And number 7, Carol Ann Duffy. Carol Ann Duffy, now, I'll be honest, I haven't really ever enjoyed her. What I've seen of her poetry of late, I've decided that I don't viscerally dislike it anymore, that actually if I pursued it, I probably could like it. During my university days, we used to hold, in a little circle of friends, we used to hold competitions to see who could write the most Duffy-esque poetry. And of course, you can imagine, if you know anything about her poetry, the subject matter and the syntax and how it's rendered, and we had a good laugh about it. We even read it out loud on student radio a couple of times. So in a sense, she's important in that we did respond to her and we did tribute to her. I like her sort of philanthropic work, I suppose you'd call it, her work in society. Like I mentioned, she does a lot to popularise poetry, particularly in schools. I think she's very hands-on with that sort of thing, and to be honest, her poetry does offer people a lot of comfort and a lot of joy, so for that reason she should probably be fairly high up. But once again, she's of our time, so I don't know if that is the right decision or not, but surely she's better than some of the ones further down the list. So Carol Ann Duffy's there at number 7. At number 8 we have Robert Bridges. Robert Bridges, some people like his poetry. Again, it's not something that's actually particularly enraptured me, it doesn't particularly speak to me, but I do like his peri, would you call it, or his work around poetry. He popularised the work, or helped to popularise the work, of Gerard Manley Hopkins. For that reason alone, he is to be lauded and respected because that's a great poet. He wrote a lot of prose as well. He wrote about Milton, he wrote about Keats, and his poetry is endlessly anthologised, and I know that some people do get a lot out of him. So I suppose for historical importance, we'll put Bridges there. After Bridges was John Masefield, and he was the poet to hold office for the second longest term, the first longest term being Alfred Lord Tennyson. I must say I don't really know too much about Masefield. Having looked at his poetry, it doesn't seem to be like hymnal like Bridges had been. It's not particularly hymnal, but he was vastly prolific. He wrote a lot of national anthems, he wrote a lot of poetry for national occasions, and I suppose that's what the office of Poet Laureate is really all about. I can't really speak much to his more personal poetry, but for that it seemed like he did a lot of work holding down the office and really committing to it strongly. So John Masefield, maybe I'll search out his poetry and see if it has any artistic merit on its own, but I must concede that I don't know him too well. Next up, we have Robert Southey. If you know his name, it is probably by virtue of some of the other romantic poets using it scorningly, because he was scorned for accepting the laureateship. He is a lake poet or a romantic poet, yet he has somewhat been lost to time, except that his name is a Byronic punchline. We don't really read Southey today, and nor should we. There's not much there to read, but I suppose for historical importance we have to put him there. After Southey, we've got Nicholas Rowe, and this is where it gets really difficult, and I'm really trying to think, well, what's the justification for ordering them in such a way? Nicholas Rowe, I don't know anything about his poetry. All I know is he was one of the early editors of Shakespeare, and he was responsible for dividing up the works, and hey, that's one of the most important jobs in the literary landscape, so we got to give it to Rowe for that. Maybe we'll look at his poetry at some point too, but for that reason alone, I think he did us a great service. He did literature and poetry a great service. And involvement with Shakespeare is justification for the placing of the next Poet Laureate, who is called Nahum Tate. If you've studied Shakespeare, in particular King Lear, in any depth, you'll know the historical importance of Nahum Tate, because his revision of King Lear with the happy ending was the dominant revision for some time. He also revised other poets of the time, and Coriolanus, other Shakespeares. Was he... I don't know if he was a good artist. or poet in his own right, but for that alone, I suppose we got to put him there for historical importance. I think it would be interesting to stage Nahum Tate's King Lear, maybe back to back, different nights with Shakespeare's original. Could be cool. After Nahum Tate, I'm going to put Andrew Motion, another contemporary, another current one. His poetry, I've looked at it a little bit. It's pleasurable, it's pleasing. I don't know if it's anything sort of groundbreaking or influential, but definitely his work with the anthologies and getting poetry into schools is very applaudable. So let's put Andrew Motion next. Now let's just read off real quick the rest of them. These are basically interchangeable, and these names read like a who's who of forgotten poets. They have been lost to time, and many of these poets, their work is actually really difficult to find. Maybe Cecil Day-Lewis would be next, Thomas Shadwell, Colley Cibber, who revised some Shakespeare and Molière, but was criticised for doing so, Warton, Eusden, William Whitehead, Henry James Pye, and Alfred Austin at the end. But in all honesty, they're all probably so lacking in any verve or any historical standout that they could be interchangeable. I mean, I'm assuming you don't know who they are. I've looked into them, and their poetry is, the stuff that you can find is, forgettable. So it's kind of interesting looking at the list of the UK Poet Laureates, because it's a kind of indicative of the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle. So you've got the first handful that are a real standout, and they stand head and shoulders above the rest, and the rest of them sort of all bleed into a forgettable mass. Whilst I would implore everybody to pick up and read Tennyson and Wordsworth as much as possible, maybe Dryden, this also is a bit of, I think it's a bit of an example that just because something is appointed or something is a prize winner, even from the absolute highest authorities, it doesn't mean that it has artistic merit. It doesn't mean that it has any redeeming qualities at all. And not that I'm saying that anything's particularly bad about some of these poets, but there is a reason that some good poets have turned down the laureateship. It doesn't really mean anything, and I feel the same way about some of the other major prizes and titles. Does from time to time someone who's really good and has a lot of artistic and historical merit, do they get in? Yeah, of course they would, because that's what they're trying to find. But I would say the majority are not, and so just because something's won a prize is not valid reason to read them alone. Because if you went through the Poet Laureates and tried to do the Poet Laureate Challenge, which I just made up, I think, and read something from every single one of them, you probably wouldn't end up reading too much inspiring poetry, because some of the best poets of all time do not make the list. Let me know if you agree with my decision. Would you wrangle? Would you shift about the top spots? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments below, and if you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe. Happy reading.